If you watched my last tutorial on RAW versus JPEG, you found out why it's so important to shoot RAW and do as much editing as possible within Camera Raw. Essentially, what you're trying to do is keep these mountains over here as large as possible. The first thing I do when I open a file, and I chose one that was clearly overexposed to see how good I can make it, is I will use this picker right here, white balance tool, and I'll find a neutral color such as gray, and that will shift your temperature warmer or cooler, or the tint more magenta or more green, and it takes out any unnatural lights that may be affecting your image. The next thing I'll do is choose the straighten tool. This works really great if you have a crooked horizon line, but in this case I have a wall back here that I can use as a guide. So I'll just drag that along that line. If I choose the right tool, I'll just drag that along that line and then straighten out my image. The next thing I'm going to do, just to get it out of the way, is exposure. And I know ahead of time that I want my exposure to be negative 1.75. That's almost 2 stops down. And it already looks pretty good. Let's preview on and off and you can see how good that looked. But I think we can make it better. You could go to contrast next, but I prefer to go to black. The blacks are a little bit too much here, so I'm going to bring them up just a little bit, and you can hit Command Z to turn it on and off to see what you did, or you can hit preview to see where you started. I think Command Z is the best way to see your little incremental movements. Next thing is whites, and I'm going to drag it all the way down and then all the way up to see what areas it's affecting the most. And right here in the cheek is where it's a little bit too hot for me, so I'm going to turn that down to about negative 15. And I'm just going to pull the shadows up just a little bit to bring a little bit of detail out in his hair. I'm going to go up to positive 25. I could go all the way up and see how much it'll do, or all the way down and see how dark it'll get. In this case, I'm going to leave it right around positive 25. And the highlights, I'll do the same thing. You can see which areas it's affecting. I'm going to bring the highlights down just a little bit, and then I'm going to actually add a little contrast just because I don't want it to be too flat. Clarity is a nice tool because it'll make skin look really soft. The problem is it makes everything a little too soft. So in this case, because I don't really mind a little bit of grittiness when in a portrait of a male, I'm going to turn it up to about plus 15. Vibrance is just kind of a color popper. It makes your colors a little bit more vibrant, and they'll pop just a little bit. In this case, I don't want to change the saturation because I have a lot of unnatural fluorescent lights. So I'm going to just take a little bit of saturation out, or just leave it. The next thing that you could do, if you're so inclined, is to crop. And you'll see it's got a kind of a weird crop now because it was straightened, but you could crop it just a little bit more. Let's take it all the way out. We'll get my ring light out of there, even though there's other ways you could do it. And we'll hit enter. We'll get a real nice crop, even though we're missing out on his barbecue here. Now here's another tool that you'll probably love as much as I do, and that's the spot removal tool. So say I don't want this mole and I don't want to deal with it later in Photoshop. So I'm just going to select an area and then click where I want it to select from. Here's another one. This one probably won't work. It took it out just a little bit. So the next thing I'm going to do is click back on the hand tool so I get my original back. Now let's see a preview. Here's what we had before. You can see the mountains are very small, and non-destructively, but actually the opposite, creating a lot, makes these mountains really big with the simple selections that I've made. The bigger your mountains are, the better detail and sharpness you have. Now, we're going to skip this because this is just kind of things that we could have already done over here. So we're going to go to detail. Now for people, I like to sharpen it somewhere around 50. But I find it's best if you zoom in to 100% so you can really see what's happening with those pixels. And in this case, I'm going to zoom into the eyeballs because to me that's the most important part for it to be in focus. So it's pretty far out of focus, so maybe in this case I would sharpen it just a little bit more. You could go really sharp, but then you get some nasty haloing. So I'm going to turn this down to about 60. Don't ever touch the radius. And detail, I don't really mess with, but if you hold Alt or Option, you can see how much detail you're actually sharpening. In this case, I don't want to sharpen much details. And masking, if you hold down Alt or Option and start to drag, you'll get white. And whatever is white will be sharpened. Anything that's black will not be sharpened. And for people, I drag it almost all the way up to about, we'll go 80, because I don't want the pores to be sharpened, just the eyes and a little bit of hair. And the next thing, and final thing I use within detail, is noise reduction. So I'll find some blacks or some dark areas, and in this case I got some shadows back here, and you can see all this noise. It's not too bad, but we can get rid of it. For luminance, my magic number is 25, and you'll just have to find your own magic number. But I like to look here, and let's click on and off and see the difference. And it's just taken out some of that noise. We could go way up, and you can really see a difference. But then you'll be affecting the skin and all the rest of your image. So I'm going to turn the noise down to around my magic number of 25. And that takes out quite a bit of your noise. Now, when you're done, you can double click on the hand up on the left and your image will fit to screen. The next really cool thing that you can do within Camera Raw is your lens corrections. And it'll open up to Profile. Go ahead and click on Enable Lens Profile Corrections, and you can do a custom automatic setup. In this case, we'll try auto, but I don't think you need to. If it doesn't automatically come up, go to Make. I shot this with a Canon, and there's the lens I shot it with. So let's preview on and off, and we'll see what it just did. That's with the correction, and that's without. So that looks pretty nice. It takes out your vignette and the little bit of distortion it has. If you want a little bit of vignette back, you get two options. You can click on Manual within Lens Corrections, and you can do a real basic one, or you can go over into Effects and you have a little bit more control over your vignettes. But before we get that far, let's go back to Lens Corrections, and you can do Chromatic Aberrations. Chromatic aberrations are basically these colors here, the purples and blues, and greens and blues down here. And usually that happens it happens a lot in windows if the light's real bright outside, or in whites along edges. In this case, I'm sure I don't have any, but may as well click it and it'll remove some of that. Now, we talked about effects a little bit. You can do your vignetting here. You can go black if you go to the left, or white, you can get the kind of old-fashioned vignette that people used to love. In this case, I want just a little bit of vignette. You can mess with the midpoint, refine it. I want it real feathered, so that, if you take it to the left, it'll have a sharp vignette. Over on the right, I want a real soft vignette. And you can mess with that just a little bit. Now, you can go in and you can convert to grayscale here, and you have a lot of, if you want your people to be in black and white, you have a lot of control by adjusting the colors. You can see his lips and eyes and a little bit of the background get real dark. And in this case, I will darken his lips just a little bit if we wanted black and white. And each color you can affect. And once it's affected, if you don't want it, you can always just click it off. Don't use that a whole lot. In color calibration, you can go back, roll back to previous forms of RAW, and sometimes if you edited it back in 2003, you can take it in and see the difference. I really have never messed with that, haven't found a reason to. You can make some presets, and save stuff if you have a basic workflow. And a lot of what you can do in Lightroom you can do in here just as fast, depending on your workload. And another tool you could mess with here is this tool right here called the graduated filter. And really all you do is click and drag. In this case it's not going to work for this picture, but for landscapes it works great. You'll create a gradient, and then you can adjust that gradient within that area, and you can give better sharpness. For skies it works really well. I take out a little bit of sharpness, and I'll take a little bit of noise to make it a little bit softer. I'll take out sometimes a little bit of clarity, sometimes I'll pump the clarity depending on how the clouds look. I'll give it some saturation. It's really good on blues. Or if you have a large area of grass, you can affect the grass. And the graduated filter is a really nice filter to use. So when you're all done and pretty happy, you can go over here to Save Image. And one thing you'll find that's important if you're editing a lot of files, always leave in document name. This is the document name right here. If you rename it without that, and then someone wants you, a client or your aunt wants you to edit a file, she's going to have to describe it when she could just tell you the image name. So in this case, I would do _Jonah. And I processed some JPEGs for another project. Try not to make a habit of it. Now when you do file extensions, if TIFF is not capitalized, that means it's a small TIFF and it's not full resolution. In this case, we're going to save it as a TIFF. You could save it as a PSD. The difference is very minimal. DNG I don't mess with. That's kind of low range with JPEG. You could also open, down here it'll say open image or open object. You could do that straight to Photoshop. I like to save it first. That way I have all this information. So in this case, I'm going to have document name _Jonah. If you wanted, you could have another one here that says shish kebab, a Q, I think is what I called my barbecue last weekend. Shish kebab, a Q, don't know how to spell that. And then you could do another _date 2014. So let's save that. I choose to save it as a large TIFF. There's a little bit of metadata here you can put in. No compression. Choose where you save it to. We'll save it to the desktop. And we're done.